5 years ago, I embarked on the classic end-to-end journey of the UK from Land's End to John O'Groats and onward to the islands of Orkney and Shetland on my previous electric motorcycle, the Zero DSR. That Land's End to John O'Groats trip back in August 2017 was the first time the journey had been undertaken on an electric motorcycle. The journey was extended after my then Shetland-based brother goaded me about giving up at John O'Groats. I've documented that journey extensively in video and in written form. It was a hugely enjoyable challenge, but was undertaken with a couple of borrowed external fast charger bricks to enable me to charge in a reasonable time. It was also undertaken on a motorcycle with no DC rapid charging facility, and most of the equipment I carried along with me was merely to allow me to charge the bike. Each stop after around 85 miles took 3 hours to recharge. At the end of that journey, as I arrived at my brother's house in Shetland, he asked the question, "Are you going on a lap of honour?" "No fear," was my answer. But come June 2022, it was time for that lap of honour, albeit on a different electric motorbike. Unlike in the world of electric cars, there is a dearth of electric motorcycles which benefit from DC rapid charging. Indeed, if you wanted to go out to buy an electric motorcycle with rapid charging and any kind of realistic availability, you're pretty much confined to an offering from Harley-Davidson or Energica. Yes, I've figured out how to pronounce Energica properly, with the stress on the second syllable after watching an interview with Energica CEO Livia Cevolini. Now, I'm aware that anyone who subscribes to my channel may quite rightly be inquiring as to when I suddenly went from being a Zero owner to an Energica owner. Well, I had planned to redo the Land's End to John O'Groats to Skaw ride on my Zero DSR again, having retrofitted the 6 kilowatt charge tank, which would have reduced my charge stops from 3 hours to around 90 minutes. But having put the Energica EVA Ribelle through its paces last Halloween weekend, on my 1,000-mile return trip from Diss to Land's End via Lowestoft, it was pretty clear that an Energica was the sensible way forward for longer touring trips. I liked the look of the EVA Ribelle the most out of the Energica range, and so my order for the Ribelle was placed in December and the bike arrived at the end of April. In the meantime, I'd been talking with friend and EV advocate James Coates, and we discussed doing the Lajog Skaw trip together, as had been the original intention back in 2017, until the unscheduled arrival of James and Kate's daughter quite rightly sidelined those plans. James had in any case still been crucial in that 2017 trip, as he drove me and the Zero down to Land's End and collected us from Forfar. So this seemed like a good opportunity to right that missed experience for him, and for us both to do the trip and show the difference a DC rapid charging bike could make to the journey. We put the date in our diaries and, having already raised the idea with them last year, the kind folk at Energica UK and the English Electric Motor Company were good enough to offer James the use of a bike to do the journey with me, while I rode my own EVA Ribelle. We discussed how we would do the journey and decided to do the main Land's End to John O'Groats leg in one go, without any overnight stops, then proceed to Orkney, Shetland and back over the remainder of the week. Before we knew it, June had come round. James went to pick up the EVA Ribelle RS he was going to be riding on Friday the 10th of June, and then on Saturday the 11th, we met up at a nearby McDonald's and rode the bikes down to Land's End. We stopped 4 times on a mainly relaxed A-road route down, avoiding motorways. Firstly, not too far from our start point, at McDonald's in Warwick, resplendent with 4 Instavolt charge points. Then at another couple of Instavolt points at Trowbridge. Our third charge stop was courtesy of GridServe at Exeter Services in Devon, and our final charge stop was at a couple of Osprey rapid chargers at the Plume of Feathers pub in Scoria near Redruth, Cornwall. We had set off just before 11:15 in the morning and arrived at our accommodation for the next couple of nights, the Land's End Bed and Breakfast and Hostel, less than a mile from Land's End, at 10 o'clock that evening. It had been a hot day and we found that the battery temperatures on the bikes were spending a lot of time in the yellow, indicating temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius, with the effect that charging speeds were throttled back and charging took a little longer, already from the second stop. While the bikes have active motor cooling, the battery is passively cooled. It would be good to see some liquid thermal management introduced into the battery packs, but we'll come back to this. Arriving at the hostel, we were shown to our room, which had a couple of bunks in a setup with shared hostel toilet and shower facilities. This was the first time I'd stayed in the hostel part of the place, having stayed in the B&B part in the past, but it was fine for our needs. Our hosts were kind enough to let us charge the motorbikes overnight too. We'd earmarked the Sunday as a day to rest before the big journey, but also as an opportunity to deal with any issues we might have encountered on the way down. As it was, there were no issues outside the matter of battery heat, so we opted first of all to make the most of the glorious weather and walk around to the neighbouring cafe for a breakfast, before we decided to take a relatively short ride to the most southerly point on the UK mainland at Lizard, 34 miles or 54 kilometres away. There's a lovely cafe, the Polpeor Cafe, right on the cliffs at Lizard Point I'd visited with my family before when the kids were a bit younger. So we headed to the Lighthouse car park and made the short walk down to Lizard Point itself, before enjoying a quick drink and snack at the cafe and soaking up the beautiful views. Suitably refreshed there, we headed back to Sennan Cove, just up the road from the hostel, where we took in the view briefly at the harbour, before we returned to the hostel and then late afternoon walked down to the Land's End restaurant and bar for a couple of drinks, followed by an evening meal. We didn't stay too late, however, heading back to the hostel by 8 o'clock, ready for a very early start. The time it had taken us to get down to Land's End sowed a slight seed of concern in our heads, and during the evening I contacted fellow Energica owner Stephen Day, who has crossed the USA on his own Energica EVA Ribelle no fewer than 3 times to date, and asked him for any advice he might have in addition to other users' experiences I could glean from the Energica owners group on Facebook, to which he responded very quickly. The main concern was that our journey down had been 306 miles, 492 kilometres, and had taken us the best part of 11 hours, and we had over 850 miles, or 1368 kilometres, to do on the Monday from Land's End to John O'Groats. It was important that we made our booked ferry crossing from Scrabster on the UK mainland to Stromness on Orkney at 1:15 on the Tuesday afternoon. If we missed that, we might be able to move the booking to the evening, but there were no guarantees, and if we didn't make it to Orkney on the Tuesday evening, we'd miss our overnight ferry to Shetland. With that in mind, we decided to make an early departure at around 3 o'clock on the Monday morning, and so a relatively early night was in order. However, ultimately a mix of excitement and nervous energy stopped any decent amount of sleep. At some point, just after midnight, I considered suggesting to James that we just head off, and he told me later that he'd had the same thought. In the event though, it was the alarm at 3 o'clock which marked time to make a move. We got up and, having already packed, didn't take long to get out and on the bikes, heading down to the start point at the Land's End signpost for 3:28. The obligatory photos had to naturally take place against the backdrop of a pre-dawn sky, but I was grateful for calm weather, in great contrast to my visit last year. It was at this point that I remembered that it was my birthday too. Yes, possibly not the most conventional way people would choose to spend a birthday, but to me I could think of few better ways of celebrating a birthday than riding a motorbike, and what a memorable way to spend it.
3 o'clock in the morning, 30th of June. Happy birthday. What a way to spend a birthday. So, James Coates and I...
James, it's your birthday, mate. I'm so sorry. Happy birthday, John.
That's alright, but...
I'm so sorry, mate.
No, it's alright. James Coates and I, about to do something very stupid. 5 years ago, James was supposed to do this trip, Land's End John O'Groats to Skaw with me. we're doing it again today on bikes which should be far more capable of rapid charging. So hopefully this is all going to go well.
By 3:40 we'd taken the relevant photos and video clips and were on our way. I'd had the presence of mind to think about leaving my rucksack in a position where I couldn't leave without it. Not riding normally with a rucksack, it would be an easy thing to do. But in the event, I did manage to leave without it and got as far as the exit to the visitor centre before I had to make a quick return to the start point to pick it up. An ominous start, but fortunately I didn't make the same mistake again for the rest of the trip. For peace of mind, we decided to make a stop at the Plume of Feathers in Skaw again at the Osprey charge points for a quick top-up, as we wanted to be confident about making it to Exeter services.
It's 4:42, we're near Redruth, just north of Redruth on the A30. We're making steady progress, we're taking it easy, and we just stopped at around 80%. We can't quite make it to Exeter without stopping, so we're stopping here. That's where we stopped on the way down. I'm currently on 88%. We're going to stop about 90 and then head on. Yeah, traffic's already picking up. It's 4:42.
Fortunately, we had no problem from there to make it to Exeter services, though the microclimates as we crossed the moors made themselves all too apparent, as the temperature dropped significantly in several places. At Exeter, we took the opportunity of our first longer charging stop to have some breakfast, while the bikes charged at the grid serve points installed there.
Okay, we just got to Exeter services. It is 20 to 7. And we've just done 100, we've done 96 since the last charge, 127 in total so far. Right, let's get going.
Suitably recharged and refreshed, we left Exeter services at 7:39 and jumped on the M5 motorway for the next leg of the journey up to Bristol. Again, like most motorway services with charge points in the UK, the points at the next services we stopped at, Moto 7 View services, just before the crossing into Wales, are operated by GridServe, who have taken over the network from Ecotricity since last year. Unfortunately for us, we arrived just a couple of days before multiple points were commissioned at Moto 7 View services, and we had to share a single rapid charge point for the first time on the journey. Not a big deal, but it kept us at the services for over another hour.
Okay, we are now at Moto services, that's 7 View services, just before crossing into Wales. We're charging here, we got here about just over 40% remaining actually. Yeah, it was quite a nice run up from Exeter. We just took it steady, averaging about just slightly over 60. But because we haven't got opposing winds now, we just found the efficiency's gone up quite dramatically. Also, of course, the M5 motorway is not as undulaty as the A30 going through Cornwall and Devon, so it's just been a bit steadier, a bit flatter. Hoping to use those fellas over there, GridServe set of charge points over there, but in the event we've had to use this single point. So I initially plugged in, got up to 90% while James charged here on this AC point, and then we swapped when I got to 90. So yeah, all going well. The weather is amazing, couldn't be better, so we lucked out there certainly.
At 10:21 we were on the road again and crossed over the Severn into Wales, following the road up past Tintern Abbey, through Monmouth and back into England, joining the A49 and heading through Hereford, past Ludlow and up to Shrewsbury. We'd established a pretty efficient way of doing the route by now. In contrast to my 2017 journey, where I had meticulously planned each stop, including contingency plans, this journey would be very much improvised, though we both had sections of route we thought would be particularly good from a riding and interest point of view. James had a section of the road in the Scottish Lowlands in mind, and I had this section of the route crossing the Severn and then directly up the A49, and then a section in Cumbria in mind, remembering them as pleasant parts of the journey in 2017. There were good reasons for not over-planning our journey. Reliant on rapid chargers, we had no way of knowing if we'd encounter faulty points and have to divert to alternatives. If we over-planned, those plans could go out of the window fairly easily, so instead we took a different approach. Having discussed and established a rough route in our minds, we developed a routine whereby at each stop, James would look for our likely next charging stop using ZapMap, with consideration that we were looking for locations with at least 2 charge points wherever possible. I would then put the charge stop location into my Garmin GPS and navigate us to the next stop. This seemed like a sensible division of duties, as James has far more experience making use of rapid charge points all over the country as part of his daily work, so certainly had some awareness of where there might be good options and more experience of the different networks than I have too. Despite using rapid chargers for a few years, they're the exception rather than the norm for me, as most journeys I've undertaken historically are within the range of the electric motorbike or car I've been riding or driving. Naturally, I have rapid charged multiple times over the years, but contrary to widely held beliefs of the anti-EV crowd, when you have off-road parking and charging, as around 75% of UK car owners do, and you do the typical kind of journeys most people do, public charging is the exception rather than the norm. Arriving at Bannatyne's Health Club in Shrewsbury, we charged at the 2 available charge points.
Okay, arrived at Shrewsbury, 28%. Shrewsbury at the Bannatynes, and we just pulled in, both chargers available. Great news. Instavolt, so we had faith in these. No problem, absolutely. Straight in. James is having the issues I had when I borrowed the EVA Ribelle last November. He's having the same issues with this beastie here, which engages the locking pin. So effectively he's having to lift it manually, and that is the same issue I discovered on unfortunately the last day of my trip last November. I discovered that little trick to engage the locking pin, because if you don't do that, the charge doesn't work. So yeah, but sorted anyway, both charging. Yeah, straight in, good old Instavolt as usual.
From Shrewsbury, we were back on the A49 and heading pretty much directly north from Shropshire and into Cheshire. James identified a set of 4 Instavolt rapid chargers at a Booth's outlet in Garstang, Lancashire as our next destination, somewhere he'd stopped in the past through his work. So I put that into my GPS as the next destination. We chatted to a couple of people there between popping into Booth's and a nearby Aldi on the off chance we could get some glove liners. As much as we'd prepared for most things, it occurred to us that riding through the Highlands overnight, our hands might suffer from lower temperatures. For my part, I could have brought my heated gloves, but it's not something which springs immediately to mind when riding in the middle of June. In the event, we didn't manage to find any glove liners, but I did have a few pairs of nitrile disposable gloves with me in my bike toolkit, which we could use if it came to it. And yes, they do and did offer a line of defence against the cold.
Okay, we're in Garstang now. We got here just after 4 o'clock, just about 2 minutes past 4, with about just under 30 miles, 30% range left, I think. We did just shy of 100 miles, so again, it's continuing very well. I think the weather's been really fair to us, so it's been overcast actually, which is quite nice actually. You don't want it sort of blazing sunshine. I think that's helped us. The battery temperatures have we've done quite a few charges now, and they're tending to go up to the yellow gauge, which means they've hit 40 degrees C, and then they drop down after a few miles riding, so it's all going quite well really. And that's good to see. That battery temperature was worrying me a little bit, because when we headed down to Land's End on Saturday, that was causing us some issues and really slowing down charging in places to an hour. But none of that this time. It seems to be behaving very well so far, and long may it continue. James got about the same time. We're just chatting with this chap about EV things, fellow biker and former biker, and obviously the usual questions. But we're finding the performance of both these bikes. James is riding the RS, which is the slightly quicker version of the one I've got. That's 2.6 seconds 0 to 60, and mine's 2.8, and it's got Berlin suspension, which he's not very pleased with actually. It's quite solidly set up for him. It's quite a rough ride, but frankly we're both glad to be here. It's time to go and get something to eat. We haven't really eaten since very early this morning, so we need a break from these seats and something to eat. Otherwise, everything's great. Really enjoying it so far.
I'd been looking forward to the next leg of the journey. The roads north of Lancaster become rural again as you head into Cumbria and skirt the Lake District. Even the M6 motorway becomes picturesque in this part of the world, and it was initially the M6 we jumped onto from Garstang, though only to bypass Lancaster at the recommendation of a local we chatted to in Garstang. I have to say, as pleasant enough as Lancaster may be, for the sake of time it was good to bypass urban areas where we could. We'd done quite a good job of this on the way up. The only busier urban areas we'd had to navigate to this point were around Hereford and Shrewsbury, and they really weren't too bad at all. This was in contrast to my 2017 trip, where I'd followed quite a strictly direct route I'd planned, which took me through the heart of some busy conurbations around the northwest of England, passing through the centres of Warrington, Wigan, Preston and Lancaster in fairly quick succession. Neither of us wanted to spend a particularly long period on motorways, but when the alternative is crawling through the fumes of urban sprawl and racking up time to do so, when we didn't have the luxury of time to do so, it was the pragmatic choice. And in opting for the motorway, we moderated our speeds, choosing to make steady progress at around lorry speeds. This also meant there were occasions where we could benefit from some protection against the headwinds we seemed to face for large parts of the journey heading north. I'm not comfortable and don't endorse slipstreaming at close distances, preferring to practice what I preach and heed the 2-second rule. But I found that even a safe following distance behind lorries offered a noticeable level of defence against the stronger headwinds. We left the M6 motorway near Carnforth and joined the A6, heading up to the picturesque Cumbrian town of Kendal. I recognised the Duke of Cumberland pub, where I'd spent a wet 3 or so hours on an evening back in 2017, charging my Zero DSR with an elaborate setup of cables running into the pub's beer cellar. I smiled to myself as I remembered having to deal with all those cables and extension leads, and the happiness when I got out of the rain and into the warmth of the pub that evening. Then, from Kendal, it was on to one of my favourite stretches, and one I was keen that we rode on this occasion. The A6 between Kendal, Shap and Penrith offers some great stretches of road. We headed through Penrith and then continued up the A6 to our next identified stop in Carlisle. Coincidentally, this was in the same car park I'd stopped with the Zero DSR back in 2017. Back then, it was a necessary contingency stop at an AC charge point. But the same retail estate car park now sports a couple of Instavolt rapid charge points.
It's 7:45, it's Carlisle, it's a retail park, and it's somewhere I stopped 5 years ago to charge the Zero. Just over there where that little car charging sign is. It's behind James, talking on the phone. Yeah, that was a lovely run up. I remember that road very well, coming up from Kendal over Shap, the A6, all the way up through Shap, and then dropping into Carlisle. Absolutely lovely road. So thoroughly enjoyed that. We got here with about, it's over 30%. We did like 70 odd miles, I believe, close to 80, maybe 77, 78. All went swimmingly well. Got her with 30 odd %, and there are now these Instavolt chargers here. So James got in, we just had to wait for one space to clear. James got in, got charging straight away, and then mine's on 73%, 74% now. Obviously it's starting to get a bit later, so I've now togged up. I've got a base layer, 2 t-shirts, and I've put this hoodie on as well, just to make sure I'm super warm. And we did have a small issue with comms, in that I couldn't hear James, but he could hear me. Fortunately, that's all resolved now, because we brought a spare mic for the Cardo Pack Talk units, so we swapped out the mic, and that's working fine now.
Leaving Carlisle and wearing more layers than I've ever worn before under my motorbike jacket, we jumped back on the M6, but only for a short stretch up to the next junction, junction 44. James had a route in mind to cross the border into Scotland. On my 2017 route, I'd climbed the remainder of the M6 into Scotland, where it becomes the A74M, and up to Crawford near Abington, taking a central route up between Glasgow and Edinburgh through Falkirk. But on this occasion, James had a stop at a McDonald's in mind in Dalkeith, southeast of Edinburgh, where we could get something to eat while recharging the bikes before the overnight section of the journey. So the route we took was initially the A7 over the River Esk, and then across the border into Scotland at Scotsdyke near Longtown. At Langholm we joined the B709, which follows the course of the Esk up through Holme and past the wonderfully named Foulbog. It was on this beautiful stretch of road, through the very distinctive fir-lined roads and meandering around the hills of southern Scotland, that we encountered our first rain of the journey. But it was light for the main part and didn't detract at all from the ride, though the state of the road surface in places elicited a few expletives, especially from James, whose Ribelle RS benefits from very high quality Öhlins suspension, but was set a little too firm for his liking. It was also on this road where we predictably encountered our first midges, but they weren't too much of a pest as we travelled along. It was just clear that we didn't want to remain stationary for longer than was necessary. We continued up the B709 just past Dewar, where we joined the B7007. Passing the sign to mark entering Midlothian, we rounded a right-hand bend and were greeted by the distant lights of Edinburgh, and began the descent towards Dalkeith, where the roads became distinctly urban again. Arriving at Dalkeith's McDonald's, we plugged in the bikes at the 2 available Osprey charge points, while we tucked into some health food and recuperated a little. I was determined to have some kind of birthday cake before the end of the day, so made do with a McDonald's muffin. Ultimately, we were there for a good hour and 20 minutes, but it was good that we took that time before we began the real slog through the night. From Dalkeith, it was onto the Edinburgh bypass, then in quick succession onto the M8, M9 and M90, across the Queensferry crossing and northwards up to Perth, where we joined the A9, which we would remain on almost all the way up to John O'Groats. The M90 was fairly tedious in the dark, but again it helped us to make progress, and we benefited once more by shielding against the worst headwinds by remaining behind a couple of lorries. Our next stop on the journey was just before we reached the Cairngorms, and just to the south of Pitlochry at the Near Limits Adventure Centre, where a couple of Osprey chargers were usefully placed, just set back off the A9 on one of General Wade's old military roads. Of course, at around 1:30 we had no problem getting onto both chargers, and spent just under an hour at the location, leaving shortly before 2:30. Right, it's about 2:15 in the morning. And we're just south of Pitlochry. So we stopped in Edinburgh for some food. I didn't do any clips there because we just wanted to get on and eat something, and we hadn't sat down and eaten anything really properly all day. So took that opportunity. We're another couple of Osprey chargers. It's some kind of craft centre place. And it's James on 93%. 93%. I'm on 89. But yeah, again, can't fail but be impressed by how these bikes are doing. It's
quite a contrast to Saturday when they were getting hot, but we think we've hit on a bit of a bit of an optimum way of working with them. It seems to be working very well. They're not overheating, and I'll probably elaborate on that further later on. Anyway, probably a couple more stops now, and we'll be at John O'Groats.
From Pitlochry, we were up into the beautiful Cairngorms and a part of the world I have memories of from childhood. I was distracted trying to remember the name of the distillery nearby to where we'd stayed when I was a child, which I can normally instantly recall. Indeed, as I narrate this, without cheating, I know it's Dalwhinnie. We passed nearby Newtonmore and then came up to Aviemore. There was a strange beauty to the road travelling at that time, and we were debating whether breaking light above the clouds was reflected moonlight or the first rays of sunrise. Certainly, between 3:30 and 3:45 there was enough light breaking through that we could make out the surrounding landscape quite clearly, and I recognised the area around Carbridge very clearly in the early morning twilight. As we descended down the hill into Inverness shortly after 4 o'clock, we were treated to the start of a sunrise over the Moray Firth, though it was obscured by the clouds. Naturally, the further north you go in the Northern Hemisphere in summer, the shorter the nights, and there were probably fewer than 5 hours of what I'd consider true night during our ride, and we were probably riding for only about 3 of those and charging for the other 2. Arriving in Inverness at 4:17 at a Pod Point charge point in a Tesco car park, we were forced for only the second time to charge in turn. James did check out another charge point in the area, but it wasn't working, so we stuck with the Pod Point one. In the event, it restricted the charge to 80%, so that's the level we both charged to. It was a slightly frustrating stop because we were too early to be able to get a coffee anywhere. It wasn't a 24-hour store, and we were starting to feel the tiredness hitting us, it now having been just over 24 hours since we'd left Land's End.
It is now 4:24 in the morning on Tuesday, and we have arrived in Inverness at Tesco here. And sadly there's only one rapid charge point. James has gone in search of coffee actually, so I've plugged mine in. We got here with 27%. Well, I got here with 27%, I should say. Currently charging at 29%. Yeah. That was actually a pleasant journey over. Familiar places from past trips and holidays indeed, past Newtonmore, that area, and Dalwhinnie Distillery, and lovely to see the sun starting to rise over there. But yeah, we're both starting to get a little bit tired, but managing to keep it together, mostly through lots of singing. But it's all going well, and yeah, probably one more stop, and well, there will be one more stop definitely, and then we should be there.
I felt relieved to be heading off at 5:34, knowing that we ostensibly had one more charge stop to make before we reached John O'Groats. We noticed that there were 2 Charge Place Scotland rapid chargers in Brora on the coastal road, about halfway up the remainder of the route. Having stopped in Brora on a couple of occasions in the past, once on my 2017 journey where I charged at the Sutherland Inn for 3 hours, and again while doing the North Coast 500 on my petrol bike back in June 2018, I knew there was a small co-op store there too, which might prove useful. However, aware that Charge Place Scotland doesn't have the best reputation for reliability, we considered that we might have to find alternative options once in Brora. Given we were leaving with an 80% charge and had to travel 57 miles, or 92 kilometres, to reach Brora, and keep some spare to seek alternative charging options should the need arise, we decided to take it easy, and I followed James, who kept a steady pace. This was by far the most difficult stretch of the whole journey for me. It wasn't a question of a weakness on the part of the bikes, but the organic squishy thing behind the handlebars. I take safety seriously when riding and promised myself that if there were one instance of me resting my eyes for even a fraction of a second, I would stop and sleep for a short time. The slightly slower pace made it worse because it was a relatively sedate, undemanding ride, and I found myself in that strange and uncomfortable dreamlike state on occasion. I noticed that James became more chatty about anything and everything, and I quickly realised and appreciated what he was doing, without explicitly telling me what he was doing. If he felt he didn't get a response, he pushed for one, and I later told him I was aware of what he'd been doing and was grateful for it, as it certainly helped. We reached Brora at 6:56, and to our relief, both Charge Place Scotland rapid chargers were available, unblocked, and most importantly, they worked. What a relief!
Okay, we are now in Brora, on the coast, on the east coast, going up. That's the Sutherland Inn over there, and that's somewhere I stopped 5 years ago with the Zero, and they were kind enough to let me charge for 3 hours while I chatted with a couple of local characters. Had quite a fun time. Yeah, we've both made it here anyway. We've got these Charge Place Scotland chargers, and to our surprise, maybe cynically, they appear to be working fine. So both bikes are charging, and we took it nice and easy up. We're both getting a bit tired, I think, but we're going to go and try and find a coffee somewhere and just recover a little bit for the last stint up to John O'Groats, which according to my sat nav says it's going to be 63 miles. So yeah, we're almost there. We're almost there. How are you feeling, James?
I'm tired.
Yeah.
I am, yeah. I'm ready to sit down and relax now.
Yeah,
And,
me too.
have a sleep.
Definitely.
For the final leg, I took the lead, and knowing that we had plenty of charge to reach destination, decided the best way to combat the tiredness was to engage my best levels of concentration and actively to ride the roads, applying my best roadcraft skills to keep myself fully alert, doing a riding commentary to myself in my head, and actively looking to make progress wherever possible. This definitely worked, and I felt revived for the remainder of the journey. We passed what now feels like familiar territory through Helmsdale and the steep Berridale Braes, before finally departing the A9 and remaining on the A99 coast road up to Wick, and then finally the approach to John O'Groats. We arrived at John O'Groats at 9:12. I thought we'd probably get there before the bulk of visitors arrived, and there were only a couple of people at the famous signpost as we rode up to it for the obligatory photos. We got talking with a couple who were kind enough to oblige by taking some photos of us alongside the bikes at the signpost to mark the occasion. And so we'd achieved the main goal of reaching John O'Groats from Land's End in one journey. Having departed the signpost at Land's End at 3:40 the previous morning, we'd taken just under 30 hours. To be precise, 29 hours and 32 minutes. According to the GPS logs, 18 hours and 53 minutes of that was moving time, and 10 hours 39 minutes was stop time. We stopped 10 times on the journey to charge. The journey wasn't over, but I felt like I had in 2017. This was the main leg of the journey complete, the one everyone recognises as the main end-to-end route of the UK. The rest would be more for fun and completeness, and would allow us to meet up with an old EV friend on Orkney. For my part, to return to Shetland, and for James visit Shetland for the first time. After the photos, James first plugged into the GridServe rapid charger located just next to the cafe, while we waited for the cafe to open at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, we were welcomed into the cafe and sat down to enjoy a celebratory breakfast. I'm not big on cooked breakfasts, but on this occasion I'd make an exception. After a while I went out to unplug James's bike and plug mine in, then came back in. I'd only been in a couple of minutes and was checking my phone when the strains of Happy Birthday were played over the cafe speakers. I didn't even twig at first, continuing to stare at my phone, but then looked up and saw the lady from the cafe approaching me with what looked like a cooked breakfast with a couple of candles on it. James had clearly had a word with the staff, and I was presented with a belated birthday breakfast. Nice gesture, and it did make me chuckle. We spent just over an hour at the cafe as it started to fill up, then decided that we should make a move to our next destination, the port at Scrabster, to catch the ferry across to Stromness on Orkney. Of course, we passed Dunnet Head, the most northerly point on the UK mainland, on the way to Scrabster, and I asked James whether he wanted to call in there to tick it off the list too on the journey. But we'd both previously been there, it is a little underwhelming, we were venturing much further north anyway, and we were intent on getting to our ferry. We timed our arrival perfectly, a good hour before the ship was due to depart, and were only conversing with other bikers a short time before we were able to board the ferry and seek out some comfortable lounge seats and the bar. On our way at 1:35 and refreshed with a drink each, while James did some work on his laptop, the tiredness finally hit me and I shut my eyes. The next thing I knew, we were approaching Stromness on Orkney and James was waking me. We disembarked at 2:49 and made the short journey from Stromness to the offices of EcoCars and Reflex on Orkney at Hatston near Kirkwall, where we were greeted by Jonathan Porterfield, who almost single-handedly has been responsible for getting many Orcadians and many people in mainland UK besides into electric cars. I've known Jonathan for a few years now. He was good enough to meet me and show me around a little in 2017. And James has a longer friendship with him going back some years. They've both done previous EV challenges together too, so it was good for the three of us to get together. Jonathan, or JP as many know him, was kind enough to arrange attendance of a journalist and photographer from the local press, who interviewed each of us and took some photos. Then we sat in the office and chatted for a while. He was even thoughtful enough to bring along some towels and shower gel and offered us the use of the office shower. I have to say that was one of the most welcome showers I've ever had, both refreshing and relaxing after the long journey. After a while, we headed into Kirkwall and to an Italian restaurant, Luciano. Quite fitting really, considering we were riding Italian motorcycles. After a very pleasant meal, courtesy of Jonathan, and drinks, we headed back to the office, helpfully right next to the ferry terminal, where Jonathan said we were welcome to wait until we needed to check in for the overnight ferry to Shetland later that evening. The ship left Kirkwall at around midnight. We arrived at Lerwick at around 7:30 and after a quick breakfast before leaving the ship were disembarked at 7:51. I was quite happy to be back in Shetland. This was my 5th visit as my brother and family lived there for a couple of decades and were still there on my last visit in 2017. My nephew is still based in Shetland but was on holiday himself when James and I arrived, so there was no possibility of us meeting up. I was slightly disappointed that the weather was not as kind as it was to me in August 2017, but it could have been a lot worse, and the rain held off for the key parts of our time there. The immediate quest was to reach Skaw Beach on Unst, right at the top of Shetland, so we headed up the Shetland mainland to our first ferry from the Shetland mainland to the island of Yell, crossing from Toft to Ulster, that's Ulster ending with an A, on Yell. There's a rapid charger at the ferry terminal on Ulster on Yell, which we'd be returning to later, but for now we were pressing on northwards. On the relatively short crossing to Yell, I stayed with and kept an eye on the bikes while James had time to nip up on deck. I wasn't overly bothered, having done so before, and it was important one of us stayed with the bikes as they aren't secured and the ferry does do some interesting manoeuvring. Arriving at Ulster, we travelled across Yell the almost 18 miles or so to Gutcher ferry terminal, to take us from Yell to Belmont on the most northerly inhabited island of Unst. This ferry is a smaller one than the one crossing from mainland Shetland to Yell, and there isn't time to do anything other than stay with the vehicles and nowhere else to go in any case for the approximately 10-minute crossing. Disembarked at Belmont, we headed further north and ultimately came to the largest settlement on Unst of Baltersound, followed by the Saxe-Voort resort, based around the former and now reactivated RAF Saxe-Voort radar station. The area once housed those stationed at the RAF radar site, but following the collapse of the Soviet Union became a holiday resort and retail complex. The base has been reactivated now, but operates as a remote radar with nobody permanently based there. Another interesting recent development is the Saxavord spaceport, which has secured planning permission to operate as a launch site for low Earth orbit payloads. We followed the single track road to Skaw, pausing briefly for a photo opportunity of the bikes above the UK's most northerly house and Skaw Beach below.
So we're just approaching Skaw Beach at the very top of the UK, and sheep's coming to have a word with us by the look of things. Tell us to sod off. Don't bring those electric things down here. I reckon that's about right. So yeah, after a good night's sleep, well, reasonably good night's sleep, probably sleep through anything, but we're here at the very top of the UK. Oh, just about to approach the beach anyway.
Then we headed down to the beach to complete the journey from Land's End to the most northerly settlement in the UK, arriving at 10:18 and repeating my 2017 journey in a much shorter time frame.
What do you reckon about framing them sort of at an angle facing back this way? With the beach in the background. Okay, so here we are, arrived at Skaw Beach on Unst. This is it. Once again, returning here. This is as far as you can go in the UK in terms of public road access, and the bikes have been absolutely fantastic all the way up. Absolutely great. Thoroughly enjoyed this trip. I know James does too. So he's just having a wander down on the beach now. I'm going to go down there as well. Be rude not to get to the beach while you're here. That's Britain's most northerly house. And these are Britain's most northerly Energica EVA Ribelle bikes, which have gone from Land's End to John O'Groats, then on to Orkney, and then on to Shetland, to the top of Shetland via Yell and Unst to Skaw Beach.
After just over 40 minutes at Skaw Beach, we began to make the long journey southwards again. Our first stop was at the final checkout cafe back in Baltersound. Yes, you've guessed it, Britain's most northerly cafe and shop. We spent a good hour there and then once more headed off back to the Belmont ferry terminal for the ferry to Yell. Sadly, our timing was poor, and we arrived just as they broke for lunch, so we were waiting almost another hour and 15 minutes until we got the ferry across to Yell at 1:41. From Gutcher on Yell, it was back to Ulster, where we arrived, hoping to charge the bikes at the rapid charger there. In the event, there was a man stood under the shelter around the charge point, his car plugged in and clearly on the phone. It didn't take a genius to work out that there was an issue.
I'm guessing it's not working. Not working.
What?
I'm guessing it's not working.
It is. We have to ring.
Okay.
Oh, is that electric?
Sorry?
Is that electric?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
Seemed a bit moody. If you're a bit civil, I'd help you.
I'm on to the help. The bloke became a little more amicable and attempted to make conversation. In response, and thinking the best solution here was to help him out and get him charging, so that we in turn could charge, I offered to start his charge with my Charge Place Scotland RFID card. The one thing I had gathered before this trip was that it was crucial to have this card, so I had ordered one in good time before the trip. The problem is that many points are in remote locations, Sometimes you don't have a data connection or even a phone connection. So I started him charging and he was at least grateful. That of course took some time, and then we both had to charge in turn. This ultimately meant that we were at the terminal for an hour and 3/4 before we managed to get the ferry from Ulster back to Toft on the Shetland mainland. It was 4:17 when we got to Toft, and we needed to get back to Lerwick for the ferry to Aberdeen by 5 o'clock. So we didn't have the luxury of time I thought we might have at the start of the day to make our way down to the south of Shetland to visit Sombra and the lighthouse there. In 2017 I had the luxury of a couple of days at my brother's house, but on this occasion we were heading back to Aberdeen the same evening and needed to get to Lerwick as soon as we could. In the event, we made it to the ferry terminal in Lerwick in the nick of time. In fact, I heard on a crew member's radio the question, "You're 100% sure there's nothing else for Aberdeen?"
You're 100% sure that there's nothing else for Aberdeen, yeah, but
That'll be it, and on your side.
We disembarked the ship the following morning at 7:14 in Aberdeen after a smooth crossing, and headed to a charge place Scotland point at nearby Aberdeen Snow Sports Centre. Interestingly, James had the first instance there of being unable to charge, but my bike charged okay. So next we headed along the road to Broomhill car park and another CPS charge point. We were there for another hour or so while James charged, then headed off. We'd spent just over 2 hours and hadn't yet left Aberdeen. Heading next to the Princes Street charge hub in Dundee, we knew there was a plentiful supply of rapid chargers. Arriving there at 10:56, I plugged in with what I recall was almost 30% battery remaining. But after an initial failed charge start and moving to a different point, I noticed my bike's battery indicated 2% on the dashboard. This couldn't be right. James's was reading okay, so I considered it to be a false reading. We briefly discussed this and suspected that the bike would need a full charge to balance the battery and update the bike with the correct percentage based on a fully charged battery. A quick call from James to English Electric Motor Company on another matter, and they confirmed that this was a good course of action. So I plugged in the bike on DC for an hour or so, the maximum allowed anyway, and then put it on an AC charge. Ultimately the charging stopped, I turned on the bike and was pleased to see it reading 100% again. Phew! But it was now 12:26 and we were still in Dundee. James quickly abandoned his initial idea of getting the bike back to Dis the same day. I had planned an overnight stop with my old school friend and best man and family near Halifax on the way back, and could see I'd be getting there later than initially thought too, though at least I didn't have as far to go as James did to get home. Things went more smoothly after that point with the charge points. We had 2 more stops at Osprey points at Haddington Retail Park in Scotland, and then back in England stopped at another couple of Osprey points at Team Valley Retail Park in Gateshead. Our final stop together was at Weatherby Services in Yorkshire, and that was a relatively short stop of around 25 minutes for me. From there we went our separate ways, with me heading the 41 miles, or 65 kilometres, across Yorkshire to near Halifax, and James heading home. It had been a long day, made longer by the lack of availability of reliable and plentiful charging at the start of the day, but I'd done another 377 miles, or 607 kilometres, by the end of the day. James confirmed that he'd got home okay, just a couple of hours after I'd arrived at my friend's house. After a good night's sleep, I was up when my friend and his wife got up and left their house when they left for work, determining first to travel the short distance to the village where I had grown up, ride a little circuit around it, as I always do to see what's changed, and to visit my parents' final resting place in the cemetery there. It was actually a perfect day and promised to be a hot one, and I quite appreciated the tranquility of the cemetery in the beautiful surroundings of Bronte country, something I never properly appreciated growing up in the area. From there, I headed over the hill back towards Halifax and to my friend's workplace before I made the journey back home. Only one planned charging stop was on the cards. I was following a social ride route back from West Yorkshire over Holm Moss with its magnificent view across part of Yorkshire. Then back home to Warwickshire via the Peak District in Derbyshire and a stop at a Pod Point charge point at a Lidl supermarket in Glossop. In the event, I couldn't initiate a charge through the Pod Point app or the website, but a quick call to the help desk got the charge started as a free one. The day was getting hotter, and I noticed as the day wore on that this was affecting my patience with other motorists, so I had to have a word with myself. I reflected though that within the space of 5 days I'd gone from wearing 5 layers to wanting to ride in a t-shirt, though that's not something I'll ever do. Dress for the slide, not the ride, and all that. I got back home ultimately at 4:23 and, dealing with the unpacking straight away, gave the bike a quick wash down with snow foam to get the worst of the week's dirt off. The proper wash could wait until the next day. I calculated that I had ridden a total of 1,924 miles, that's 3,096 kilometres, over the 5 days, and the total costs at rapid chargers over that period came to £87.64. That's around $108 or €102 at the current exchange rate at the end of June 2022. So, on reflection, what had 5 years between doing this trip on an electric motorcycle shown? Perhaps the biggest surprise for me was how fortunate we were with charging. It's true that we had been careful to identify locations with at least 2 rapid chargers wherever possible, but only on a few occasions had we had a delay in being able to charge, and on the main leg up from London to John O'Groats only twice. This alone is testament as to how rapid charging infrastructure is coming along. We didn't have to go to extraordinary lengths to carefully plan our charging stops as we would have done only a few short years ago. Instavolt, Osprey and GridServe were the outstanding charge networks of our trip. Charge Place Scotland has some work to do. Having once had a comparatively excellent network, they've been overtaken by the former. We were especially impressed where we encountered at least a couple of charge points at a location, and when you turn up to multiple points, it's just extra peace of mind. But the true heroes of this were the bikes. For us, it was a challenge in terms of physical endurance, in terms of just staying awake and safe. But the bikes were able to charge time after time without problem, once we'd identified the best approach for multiple charges. Ultimately, what worked for us on this trip, where multiple successive charges were involved, was keeping the maximum speeds down to 60 miles per hour, or 100 kilometers per hour, and knocking the charging amps back to the factory default of 60 amps rather than the maximum of 75 amps. Doing this, we were able to rapid charge time after time. The biggest illustration of this was that following our 10th stop on the main journey at Brora, while the battery temperature indicator had gone yellow, indicating a raised battery temperature of over 40 degrees C, it was back to green once again after riding only for about 10 minutes. Our only niggles are relatively minor. James found the suspension hard, but that could be fixed with a custom setup suspension. The seat comfort could perhaps be improved, though I found it okay, perhaps being used to riding for long periods on bikes. As James said, he has historically ridden only short journeys, so while this was an exceptional journey for me, it was even more so for him. Again, custom seats and cushions are always options. Perhaps the biggest gripe for me, and it's one I've mentioned previously in my Lowestoft to Land's End trip, is the position of the cruise control button. In the first instance, it's positioned too far from the throttle, so I often tend to reach over with my left hand to activate it. But there's an even more potentially dangerous problem which has presented itself. On 2 occasions now, while attempting to engage the cruise control button, my gloved finger has slipped down to the kill switch, and the bike's motor has cut out. The only way to restart it is to hold the brake lever and press the start switch, but doing that on a motorway is not ideal. On a recent ride, I had to pull over to the hard shoulder to restart the bike. Fortunately, I was in the first lane, so was able to. The same thing happened to me on this trip, heading down to Land's End, and on this occasion, trying to restart the bike while still moving, the motor warning light came on and the bike needed a few restarts before the light went off again. Consequently, I am extremely wary about using cruise control. But these are minor gripes when considered in the totality of the bike as a proposition for an electric motorbike on which you can cover long distances in reasonable time periods. The bikes were exceptionally good, and touring long distances on the Energica range is truly a viable proposition. Just choose your charging stops wisely. Thanks for watching, and before I close off, a few thanks to other people. Firstly, I'd like to extend my thanks to Stephen Day for his words of advice on long distance touring on the Energica bikes, and to Sam Baker and of course Jen at New Zeroland for their inspiring YouTube content. Thanks to James for his company and support on the journey, which was extremely welcome, and I'm so pleased for him that he finally got to do the journey. I'll put a link to his video on the trip in the video description. Thanks especially to Andrea, Alec, Ollie and Nathan at Energica UK and English Electric Motor Company for offering the use of the bike to James for the journey. And finally, thank you to Energica of Modena, Italy for building such a wonderful and capable bike. As we were doing this trip, the news of the new Xperia model, a proper sports tourer model, was relatively fresh, and that promises to be a perfect fit for this kind of ride. Though I've fallen in love with my EVA Ribelle, so I look forward to that love affair continuing for some time yet.